So just to start us off, some of you already touched on this in your intros, but I guess Newton, you can start off since I started with you. Just a little bit about how you got from your time at Tufts to now and what led you to clerking.
Yeah. So this clerkship is my third job in 2 years. So, take my advice with a grain of salt. No, I went to law school. Well, I went to college knowing that I wanted to go to law school. But when I got to law school, I didn't know really anything about the practice of law. I just kind of was like, oh, lawyers make decent money. That sounds like a good career plan. So going into law school, I, frankly did not know what a clerkship was. But one of my first year professors, my torts professor, Professor Maldonado, she kind of took me under her wing. And she, kind of guided me to an internship my first summer after law school with Judge Greenaway, who I now clerk for. So, she gets points for that. And, kind of told me sort of a career path I could take. She had previously clerked for Judge Greenaway, when she was coming out of law school. So kind of my path from Tufts to here was really, guided by that one law school professor. I worked at a New Jersey law firm, McCarter and English, for a year. One of the things she said was get law firm experience. I did a New Jersey Supreme Court clerkship for a year. And then I'm doing this clerkship now. She said kind of, well, you should do 2 clerkships, kind of considering my career goals. So that was kind of my path from, August 2012 to now.
And I don't know if anyone else wants to share, Graham, Brigid, a little bit more about how your journey was different or similar, if you also like a professor that really stood out to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I had the exact same path, really. I went to college. I didn't know I wanted to be a lawyer. And then my junior year, I thought, oh, maybe I can try and I'll take the LSATs. Let's see what happens. So I ended up going to law school, kind of the classic story. Like I wasn't sure what else I wanted to do. I knew it interested me. So I went to law school right from college. And so I think that's kind of a common path. But Graham, I know you had been a paralegal, and I work with a lot of lawyers that were paralegals prior to going to law school, and I really envy them. So I went straight through. I'm not sure if I would recommend it based on my experience. I really admire people that had work experience, especially in the legal field, because that really solidifies kind of why you want to go to law school. I think for me, I said I wasn't sure what else to do, so that's why I went. But I admire people that took time to think about what they were doing before they decided to go to law school.
Yeah, happy to speak to that a little bit too. And I think that's right. I think echoing some of the comments that have already been said, I think when I started college, I had some inkling that maybe I wanted to be a lawyer, but it was one of 3 or 4 things I was thinking about. And I didn't, have any lawyers in the family growing up. I didn't, really know anybody who was one or knew what the practice was like. And so I took the LSATs, like a lot of people, the fall of my senior year, and actually didn't do nearly as well as I wanted it to. And that, I think, ended up being kind of a blessing. I decided to put off law school for a year, go get some work experience. And I'm really glad I did. It was super helpful in, one, figuring out whether I wanted to be a lawyer and whether the daily practice was something that appealed to me. Part of it, too, was, I wanted to do litigation coming out of college. And I came out of college in 2010 when the last financial crisis was happening and jobs were a little scarce. So I took the first thing that was available to me, which happened to be a corporate paralegal opening. Ended up really liking it. Would never have pictured myself as a corporate lawyer, but I've been one for, going on 6 years now. And so, and I think partially too, I'd advocate anyone getting work experience before going back to college or back to law school, either in legal field, although that's sort of the most directly applicable, but any work experience is helpful. And that at least I found that the difference between being a student and being in the professional world is enormous. And I learned a ton as a paralegal, just like what what the expectations are in the professional world versus being a student that was enormously valuable in conditioning me for, I'd rather not have had to learn that at the same time I was learning how to be a first-year lawyer, put it that way. So I obviously, lots of paths to get to law school, but I'm a huge proponent of people doing work experience, and particularly if you're thinking about being a lawyer and thinking about working in a law firm, a paralegal is probably the best way to get directly applicable experience in that world.
And then Jiabin, you might as well pop in as well, a little bit about your experience.
I think I agree. I agree with what everyone has been saying about getting work experience before getting to getting law school. I think that's really helpful in terms of this helping you decide what practice of law that you want to focus on, because there's so many, and like Brigid and you and I went straight to law school, so it can be overwhelming at first when you got to law school. Like 1L is tough enough without having to figure out which practice area you want to focus on. So definitely agree with that. I mean, personally, I went to immigration law. I didn't have a plan going to immigration law when I started law school. I actually specialized in business law while in law school. But just one thing led to another. I didn't do any internship for my 2L summer because I was in China preparing for Chinese bar exam. So that's how I spent that summer. So, but that's just my personal experience. So, but anyway, I just when I after I took the California bar, I looked for job, and that's kind of the first thing that was available to me, even though I don't have any immigration background or experiences. And I jumped into that job and learned a ton. And now I'm working in another firm, but specializing in immigration as well. So that's my personal experience.
And then let me just stick with you since I ended with you last time. How do you feel that Tufts specifically may have helped you prepare for law school? Maybe like something you majored in or a class you took?
I think probably just generally speaking, I think the maybe that those seminar classes which have very intensive ratings that could be helpful, because I think one or two of the most important skills that law school is trying to teach you is writing and reading, essentially. I mean, that's what LSATs personally, in my personal opinion, is all about, and that's what a lot of law school classes are about as well. So I think any classes that you can take that can improve your reading skills and the writing skills would help you during law school. We can go on diving into the deep like the differences between law school writing and undergrad writing, I guess. But I would just stop there.
Does anyone else want to hop in? Maybe a class you took, a professor you had that like really pushed you and you like really were thankful for it when you went to law school?
So I didn't have a specific class. I really didn't know I wanted to go to law school till kind of the end of my college career. But people recommend that you take logic. And so I did take logic because apparently I did take it. So it does help you with logic games on the LSAT. And that was my worst class all of college, which is hilarious because I'm now a lawyer, but it was so hard. The professor I had, I forget her name, was fabulous, but I will recommend logic because it did help me with logic games, even though while I was in the class, yes, that is her name. Whoever put it in the chat, she's fabulous. I went to all her office hours. I needed to go to all her office hours, honestly. She was amazing, and that really helped with the LSAT specifically. I wouldn't say it helps. Maybe it does. I might have forgotten, but it really helped with the LSAT. So I would recommend logic. My background, I was a Spanish major, so maybe I just wasn't ready for that type of math class, but it was difficult for me, but it did help me. So that's the only class I would recommend. But I echo everything that's been said, reading, writing, kind of just the basic comprehension skills.
Yeah, I have to second the logic recommendation. I wasn't thinking of that, but it was actually super helpful for the LSAT. That was a great call. For me, I was a political science and philosophy major. And while I don't have, I guess some of the classes where you touch on, kind of enlightenment political philosophy, anything that, the 1776 crew might have been interested in, I guess could be helpful if your goal is to, pass constitutional law when you take it in law school. But I think in general, kind of that course of study was helpful for law school, because I think sort of one way to think about the law school experience is what's going on, particularly with professors who do the, Socratic method, where they call you and ask a bunch of questions that, either have no answer or they know the answer to. It's all about getting you to think, differently than you might in your regular life. And I just thought that course of study, the poli-sci department, the philosophy department, specialized in getting you, I guess, getting your mind fit to do that kind of reasoning from text.
I'll just give Graham the next question. So when you first went to law school, what stereotypes were true versus when you jumped in, you're like, wow, like I was not expecting this to be the case. Maybe it was like people were friendlier than you thought. It was way more competitive than you thought. You can take that question as you may.
Yeah, sure. I think I actually had a pretty good law school experience relative to expectations, which is not to say I'd be eager to go back and do it again, but it was far less brutal than I think it was made out to me. Maybe that's the useful lesson, is to set your expectations, assuming it's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and you'll be pleasantly surprised. But I think overall, and curious for the other panelists' thoughts on this too, I found that people in my 1L section, and for anyone who doesn't know, as a 1L, most law schools are set up such that you take basically all of your classes with the same group of 50 to 70 people. So you get to know those folks really well, and you form study groups within those, and they really become some of your closest connections during, 1L is often the sort of the crucible of law school. It's, no one has any idea what they're doing. In some ways, your grades that year are the most important of all the grades in law school, and it's kind of an unfair combination, and everyone's suffering together. I think that, stereotypically, that goes the way of turning Lord of the Flies. I actually found the opposite, where most people really banded together and were really there to help each other across the finish line and help us all comprehend the same stuff, because we were all pretty much in the same boat. So that helped enormously. First year of law school is tough, and having people around you, or even if there's I think some of the stereotypes are probably true. There's certainly people in my section who fit some of those, check the boxes that maybe aren't the most flattering characterizations. But you'll find people within your section who you get along with, and who you have a good rapport with, and who you study with, and those become people that you're still I'm still friends with, and still and that is really key. So it really makes the law school experience a whole lot more pleasant.
And then quickly, oh, go ahead, Brigid.
No, I was just going to say, I completely agree. I was pleasantly surprised, I think. And you have to remember, like, you're going to school, so the professors are there to help you. You have to take them up on their offers, but you will have Socratic method and cold calling, but it's okay, because they have office hours and they're there to support you. So even if the class feels scary, or there's a lot of pressure because you're being called on in front of 80 people, their professors are there to teach you, and they really care about the material. So yeah, I really enjoyed law school. And I did also, similar to Graham, make some of my closest friends. You just learn so much. It's really just I thought it was a very fun environment. And after 1L, there's a lot of other opportunities. As Newton was saying, he interned, and you can join clubs, and you can practice under guidance of other attorneys. So it just keeps getting better, really. Second year is great. And then third year, you kind of have the option of taking classes you might never have taken. 1L. So I took like a law and literature class, and we read Pride and Prejudice and analyzed it together. And so there's a lot of great options once you get past that first year of like all the core classes.
And I just want to echo, Bruce, I thought that was a really good point about, there are a lot of resources there to make law school less miserable, but it's kind of up to you to go access them. And most of the time, they're not something that someone's going to come to you and I was someone, just to say it, in undergrad, was not apt to go to professors' office hours, and maybe I should have more often. I think maybe I started to senior year when there were classes I came across that were really, logic may have actually been one of them that really started to crush me and disrupt my GPA in a really significant way. But that's, I think that would be a good lesson to take forward, is for something that I kind of had to learn the hard way, is to be a little more proactive of, if you don't understand something, by the time you get to the test, in law school classes, most of them, there's one exam. It's your only assessment. It's the final. If you don't understand at that point, it's too late to find out. So, be proactive throughout the course of the semester, and the resources are there, but you do have to go access them.
Would anyone else want to chime in, or?
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with everything that's being said. It's just pretty similar experience to me. I guess we just being fed to too many horror stories, I guess, how competitive things are at law school, then presently surprised when we got there. It's not that bad. But I guess one thing that could be one reason that's the case is probably nowadays just people who want to go to law school, who actually go to law school, just have more diverse goals. Like coming out of law school, not everyone is trying to get into big law, so probably that's one of the reasons it's not that competitive. And then another thing I want to add is just how I was surprised, I guess, how diverse the population, both in my 1L class session as well as the entire class, is how diverse people background is. We got people from military, from who has worked in professional as a professional for many years, or who have done a PhD in another field, chemistry, physics. So just literally people from all walks of life, and that could be a very beneficial for someone like me, who just went to law school straight from college. So
I will also say that is one of my favorite things about law school. Like, I took 2 years in between undergrad and law school, and I was really worried that I would be the oldest and be behind. And that's like a really silly thing to think, because then I came to law school and like so many of my classmates had graduated in 19, or like I'm in school with like single mothers. I'm in school with military personnel. I'm in school with people who, one guy ran a cheesesteak shop for 10 years. So like you meet like so many cool people. And it's just like, I don't know, it's like the magic of law school, because you think like, okay, maybe I didn't major in this or that. I mean, I majored in like Japanese literature, so never be coming with whatever you want. But before I move on with the next questions, I do want to introduce on the call, we have the new Tufts pre-law advisor here. Her name is Dovi King. And I know in my like law school pre-law journey, I used the pre-law mentors a lot. So if you're an undergrad or even you're an alum, definitely use her, because I'm sure she's an incredible source. So moving on, I'm just curious if any of you felt like you fell into a specific law school stereotype. Maybe you were a gunner, or maybe, you were someone who was always late to class, and you like didn't think that you would ever fall into one of those roles.
I don't know about the word gunner, but I definitely was in school. I raised my hand all the time. It's the only way I could stay engaged. I did know that about myself kind of going in, that I had to be participating to kind of be, to have a good experience. So got unmuted. But yeah, so that was my, was there anything else that I fell into? Yeah, that was hand raised, every single question. That was me.
I don't think I did. I'm not aware of all the stereotypes. Gunner, of course, is one. And it reminded me, Newton, when you say that you raise your hand because it keeps you engaged. If you were in class with Newton, you might not know that's his learning style. So you might just be like, why is this kid answering every single question? So I was going to say this earlier, but when you're in law school and you're in a room with 80 other people and one professor at the front, and you don't know anyone's grades, you don't know their writing styles, you don't know if they're even paying attention just because they sit in the front row or answer all the questions or don't say anything. It doesn't really mean that they are doing the best. So I wouldn't say I fell into a stereotype. I hated being cold called. I would sweat when I had to answer. It was just not my style. I preferred smaller seminars. But I would just say, if when you're in class, don't judge people based on how they act in the section class, because you don't know people's grades and you never will know until you have like people telling you what class rank they are. It doesn't matter how you act in class. It matters how you do on the final. So I would agree with Newton, really try and find your learning style, because once you know that about yourself, all you have to do is focus on yourself. And so I think law school sometimes can be a place where people feel like they're back in college. I kind of observed this. I didn't partake, but you do a lot together. It's really hard. It's stressful. So you're spending a lot of time with each other. You're going out on the weekends. You have lunch, dinner, breakfast all together because you're studying all night. So I would just try and be aware that like you are an adult and this is a professional setting and you're there to get a law degree. You're really not there for like college 2.0. So I think some people fall into that whole, oh, I'm section A and this is my crew and we're having a beer pong tournament, but none of that is going to really help you do well on the test. So really just focus on yourself and your learning style, because there's so much that goes on in law school. It's a big, like, I at least found or observed that it was a really big like social time for a lot of people when you're there to get your law degree and you're paying for your law degree and it's there to set you up to become a lawyer. So I would always just keep that in the back of your mind, regardless of your style. Just remember why you're there, I guess.
Oh, did you want to add to that, Graham, or?
Oh no, I think that all makes sense to me, and I think I agree with with pretty much all of that. That it's really easy to get psyched out by how if someone appears to be doing better, and the cruel sort of nature, particularly of first year and in first year classes, that everyone's on a curve. So there is an element of competition where there's there probably is going to be one A, and most people are going to get a B plus or between a B and an A minus. And so there is some level of unfortunate and sort of inevitable interpersonal competition, and it's easy to get psyched out by someone who really seems to have their act together when maybe you don't feel as confident. And I totally agree with Brigid that it's figure out what works for you, and the sooner you can figure that out, the better. I found that like a lot of times in the law library there were previous exams with old sample answers that I could use to like take a practice exam and compare my answer to the one that was held up as like a pretty good example. And that was really helpful for me as like a self-test before I actually had to take the test, because otherwise like there just aren't enough tests to figure out whether you know something or not. The one point maybe I would add is that I think it's true that like stay within yourself, and law school is expensive and it's 3 years of your life, so take it seriously, and and more than ever when it's a competitive world. But it also remember too that your law school classmates often end up being your professional network and lifelong friends. And so I don't think this is what Brigid meant to like ignore everyone and become a hermit. But it probably that's depending on your style, that may not be super mentally healthy for you either, and may lead to some exacerbating of some of the stress of law school that occurs anyway. But it is helpful to like one of the nice things about law school for me is I came out with more friends than I went in, and that's a good thing to keep in mind too.
And then kind of adding to that, like whenever like, you might have felt like caught up in those moments, like, or you felt like overwhelmed by school, like were there any hobbies or things that you would do to relax, calm you down, that you carried with you either from undergrad or you found in law school that helped balance everything when it just became super overwhelming?
I would say that this is wisdom I think I got sort of just before starting law school is when it is overwhelming, the best thing you can do is take a step back. You know, like I had like kind of hard rules studying for finals, let's say. Um, the number of credits a course was worth would be the number of 8-hour days that I would study for it. The night before a final or the day before a final, I would stop at 5 p.m. If I haven't learned it by then, I'm screwed. So, I knew that going in, so I'd work hard. But kind of when your mind is not right, if you're exhausted, if you're pulling consecutive all-nighters, not only are you, going to break down physically, mentally, emotionally, it's going to reflect in your performance. So whether you are more interested in keeping your mental health, intact, or you're more interested in doing well, listen, or kind of feel, the signs and learn when to close the book and step away. Um, you know, my personal habit was, it was in law school, mostly video games, just like in college and just like now. I was too broke to go out and do other hobbies. But the important thing is that powering through, studying all night is hardly ever the best option. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And I would emphasize any hobbies you have now or that you want to pick up in college, you should just keep them. It's difficult, but it's not like this crazy thing where you could be at school for a long time, but you have time and you have weekends. And as time goes on in law school, you'll have less days of classes. So just keep your hobbies, keep in touch with your friends. Don't, as Grim said, don't become a hermit. Really just try and stay as normal as you can. Of course, finals is crunch time, but during the year, you should always try and just maintain a life outside of being a law student.
One thing that was helpful for me, and maybe more of a fortunate circumstance than anything else, but because I went back to law school after a couple of years, I ended up living with non-law students the whole time I was in law school, which ended up being really nice. And then I'd go home to roommates dealing with the same thing. And I'm actually curious for the rest of your guys' thoughts if you did live with other law students. My fear was always that I'd go home and just torts or contracts or whatever, and I'd get totally wrapped around the axle and drive myself off the deep end. And so it was nice to be able to go home and talk to someone who was just working 9 to 5 or had a real job out in the real world and was not concerned with what I was doing, and it had some diversity of conversation and thought.
Completely agree. I lived with 2 friends from college, 9 to 5s. It was so nice. And they kind of talked me off a ledge or just kind of changed the conversation. Because especially with your law school friends, even if you go and get lunch or coffee, you're going to end up talking about law school. So even if you don't live with other people or you don't live with non-attorneys, non-law students, really try and see them because they'll bring you back down to earth.
I lived with my parents during law school. So it resulted in me spending a lot of time in the law school library. My 3rd year of law school, I did live with some law school friends. But by 3rd year, nobody was worried about law school anymore. Everybody was, we were, senioritis happens there too.
Yeah, I like commute back and forth with my parents as well. And the thing that keeps me most grounded, like before law school, I taught fitness classes and I still teach fitness classes, even though I'm in law school, because that's what makes me happy. And like when I'm having a bad day, like I know I'll put my mic on, I'll learn my choreography, and I remember like how confident that makes me feel. And that can like reflect in the classroom. So definitely like find something you love outside of law school. Like it's really grounding, and like it just reminds you like who you are and that like you're capable. And then I think we just had a question in the chat. I can read out loud, or it's a long one if someone would like to read it and just jump right in. But just talking about picking an area of law to specialize in, if any of you have any specialties, or how that's been advantageous in your career.
So I went into law school thinking I wanted to do like education law. And so then because I took the core classes, con law, contracts, torts, you don't really get exposed to what practice is like. And that's why I emphasize so much that you should try and get outside of the law school 2 and 3L year. Internships, clinics, journal sometimes, but really just getting out and either interning under a lawyer or doing a clinic where you have your own clients. So I did my 3L year. I thought I wanted to go into juvenile defense work, and now I'm a business lawyer, so I clearly didn't do that. But I did a clinic for a year in Boston. It was at the BMC, I think, the municipal court downtown, representing juveniles, and it was the hardest like 9 months of my life. It probably affected me emotionally more than like 1L year, just because it was so grueling, and I realized that I care about the work. I could not do it emotionally. So that turned me kind of away from representing clients in court. And so that's when I took corporations and I said, oh, I kind of like this, and I'm not crying every day. So let me look into this. And so I would just say 2 and 3L year, try out a lot of different types of law that you might not be exposed to normally, because it's usually just like a 2-month, 3-month thing, and then you can move on to the next one. And so now I do business law, and even when you get into practice, I think you still get the opportunity to try a bunch of different things, especially if you're at a firm, or a bigger firm, I would say. So always keep the door open. I would never suggest somebody pick something and just go all in for it before trying at least a few other practice areas around that, because you'll be spending so much time with your colleagues, with the material. So really just make sure that you've been exposed to enough that you're making kind of an educated decision.
Yeah, happy to jump in there too. And I another plug for work experience prior to going back to law school. And back to my earlier comment about winding up in corporate practice because of my paralegal experience, when I otherwise almost certainly would not have. The other thing that I ended up doing that I found was helpful, which probably, now that I'm thinking of it, probably puts me in a law school stereotype, but was trying to do as much information gathering ahead of time as I could. And in terms of, including reaching out to cold calling alumni at Tufts through the alumni network, who I thought were in either at firms or in practices that I thought looked interesting, and either Tufts alumni or law school alumni that I thought might be interested in talking to me. And a surprising number of them were. And those conversations were super helpful. And those folks had been through the same decision-making process and figuring out why they decided to have the practice they did, or how they wound up where they did, was super helpful in figuring out, even within within a large law firm, the practice groups are super varied in terms of both content and what your day-to-day is like. And even within a corporate department, different specialties can often be hugely different. So doing that information gathering for me was really helpful, figuring out, what the ideal mix was. And, it's something that's continued to evolve over time, but it was helpful to have at least that baseline knowledge as a starting point.
In my experience, and I'm someone who was sort of put into a practice area my first year out of law school, when I was at a law firm. But now, after my clerkships, I've recently went through the process of looking for, another job after this one. And one of the things that was important to me was really flexibility, and not being pushed to specialize at a particular place. I think in most cases, if there is something that you want to do, like Brigid said, really try it out. And if you do find that the reality matches up with the idea, that's great. Not only do you know what your goals are, but you'll have, there will be classes in that subject area. There will be, internship or job opportunities while you're in law school to do that. But if not, I mean, that is something to less in law school worry about. But when you are looking for a job, talk when people interview you about, hey, am I going to be pushed to specialize? Am I going to be, if I'm in a prosecutor's office, am I only going to prosecute one type of case? If I'm going to a law firm, and am I only going to deal with, transactions in one sort of business segment? Like we only represent, biopharmaceutical companies. If you're going, I guess if you're going on the teaching market, they're going to ask you to specialize, for example, if that's your goal, if you want to be an academic. But there's no need to specialize. But if there's something you want to do, you can pursue that vigorously if you so choose.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think I agree with everything that's being said. Is just there's absolutely no need. I think to specialize, especially prior to entering law school, definitely no need to do that. I mean, even you decided you thought you want to do one thing, you probably would change your mind. After 1L, 2L, you so many times. Definitely no need to decide very early on which practice area you want to focus on. Keep an open mind and try different things. Try to use every opportunities at law school, out of law school, to get yourself exposed to as many practice areas as possible, because there are just so many practice areas, and there's a lot of niche practice area that you just won't be able to get to know about, to get exposed to during law school. So yeah, take every opportunity you got.
But maybe just one final thought on this is that I guess maybe one of the cool aspects of law school is that you're actually in many ways you're asked to specialize or start choosing a career track pretty soon after the law school experience starts. And I guess what I mean by that is that often, and I'm speaking mostly from my own experience as someone who went into a large law firm, but the interview process for large law firms basically starts the summer after your 1L year. And you get, some opportunity to sample different practice groups in that intern experience between your 2L and 3L years, but it ends up going by pretty quickly. It's only about 10 weeks, so it's hard to get a really deep, a deep knowledge of multiple things during that time. So to the extent that you can sort of preload your research and do some of the fact gathering before your law school experience starts, not to add stress to everyone's plate, and I'm sure that the process of getting into law school is stressful enough in itself. But to the extent that you're able to do some additional fact gathering before you start, that takes an enormous amount of that stress off at the time you actually have to make the decision, and can help guide your course a little bit.
All right, we have tons of questions in the chat over here, so I'm going to get to what I can. Zoe asks, could you give some cold call pointers? Zoe, I will speak to that quickly first. It is okay. Sometimes you're not going to know the answer, and that is okay. That is the first thing I want to say. But if anyone else wants to speak to that as well.
I just think professors aren't going to remember what you say, really. I think is my thought. I was terrible at cold calling. Even if I knew the answer in my head, I couldn't get it out clearly because I was so paranoid that there were like 80 other people watching me. So I would just say, do your best, be prepared for class. I think nowadays professors will tell you like if they're a cold calling type of professor or if they take volunteers. So if they're cold calling, which a few of mine were, I just made sure that I was prepared for the questions that would come out of the reading. And generally your homework is a few cases. So read the cases, know the facts, know the outcome, but do your best, try and speak clearly. It's not the end of the world if you say, I don't know, or if you get it wrong, because it is difficult. I think cold calling gets really hyped up, but it doesn't really affect your final grade. I think it would affect it if you don't participate, but just do your best.
I was not clear. Sorry, that was my question. I am so sorry. I was not clear on the context of cold calling. It was more in like cold emailing or like cold research, like reaching out to like attorneys or alumni, just sort of the best decorum to use in that. Sorry for not clarifying.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I guess I'll take that one because I suspect it was generated by something I said. But I think it, you could be a short note, just say, hey, I'm a Tufts student, Tufts alumni, whatever your status is. I'm thinking about going to law school or entering this type of practice. Saw your practice from the internet or wherever you stocked them from, right? And would love to catch up if you have a half an hour at some point at your convenience. I used to try to ask people to grab a cup of coffee, partially because I was a law student. It would be a nice excuse to have someone who was probably pretty well paid buy me a cup of coffee. Now that I think it's probably even easier, folks are happy to catch up over Zoom or by call. And a surprising, many people just ignore the email. Look, folks are busy. Some are more or less tolerant to this stuff than others, but a surprising number of people got back. And I don't know that there was a huge, a lot of magic to the content of the note, other than to keep it brief and polite, and then kind of hope for the best and cast as wide a net as you can, and you'll get a fairly surprising number of hits that way.
And then also, do you guys have any recommendations for LSAT prep, how you personally prepared for the LSAT? I know I used an LSAT prep company called the LSAT Nerds, and they were amazing. They're all over Zoom, and they would offer free group workshops for specific question types. But I don't know if any of you did something similar.
I also did a LSAT company. I think it was Blueprint. In terms of preparing, that logic tip that Brigid gave earlier is really still a good one. Even if you don't want to actually take the class for credit, it is kind of something you could start with a textbook on your own. If you were so inclined. If you can afford one, a tutor can be quite helpful. A 10-point bump in your LSAT is equal to, admission at, X schools or Y dollars from the schools, that you might have already been admitted to otherwise. I would also say that in terms of my own preparation, I wish I had been more disciplined studying for the LSAT. I was doing it, senior year of college. I had I was living off campus with my friends. Let's just say nights were not spent studying. Days were also not spent studying. I didn't pay for the course myself, so I didn't take it that seriously. But I would say that whatever kind of path you pick, whether you're doing self-directed with like an LSAT company, or you have a live tutor, the discipline is important because it's really a short period of time. Once you take the LSAT, you can forget all about it, but it will be worth a lot to you, in terms of, like I said, where you can go to law school and how much money they will give you to go there.
I definitely agree with that. And the cautionary tale for me is, I took an LSAT prep course. I think I took Kaplan the summer before my senior year with the intention of taking the LSAT. I think it was like end of September, that one. And I didn't put in the work, frankly. And I went to the classes. I did some of the reading. I did most of the exercises. I kind of skated through it a little bit, and I didn't do nearly as well as I thought, and it kind of led me to a different path to law school. But I think the courses really are super helpful, but they are what you put into them too. And the second time, I ended up taking this LSAT a second time when I was applying to law school for real. The logic games were always the part that I found the hardest. I think the good news is that's probably the case for many people, and they're also, I think, theoretically the most teachable part where people are going to improve the most. So I bought a book called The Logic Games Bible and did a little bit of study on the other areas, but mostly just did, would get up at 5 in the morning before I work, which was brutal, but do a couple of logic game sections every day before I went to work for like the month before I took the LSAT the second time. Then I scored, I think, 12 points higher, which is an enormous difference. So huge advocate for, the books are awesome and they will do the job, but only if you actually do what you're supposed to do with them.
Yeah, and one of the things that Graham said was super important, like the logic games particularly, but most of the logic section on the LSAT, it might be really hard for you the first time you look at it. Like if you were doing a practice test cold, no preparation, like don't be discouraged. The LSAT is something that you can learn. It's not a knowledge-based exam. If you've been looking into it, you'll find it's it is a test that tests your ability to take tests or learn tests. It's not, testing anything other than that. They've sold it to the law schools as presumably having some correlation with how well you'll do your first year of law school. But that's all it is. It's something that you can, you can go from 0 to hero if you just put in the work on it.
And then kind of adding to that, like what's one piece of advice that you wish you'd given your younger self going into law school?
Mine would be, I wish I took time off to work.
Probably mine will be the same advice, but other than that, I guess just work harder, I guess, during your 1L year, because 1L grades are just so important. Probably, yeah, I mean that's I can even go ahead and say it's just the most important thing out of law school for you career wise. So definitely putting the effort doing that 1L year. I know it's brutal, it's tough, but you'll get through it.
Yeah, I think I would echo that comment where it's tempting to, especially the way most courses go. Traditionally, the study path for 1L courses is to put together a big outline of everything you've used and use that as your study guide. And the act of putting together that outline is a good way to figure out if you understand something. It's really easy to find people's old outlines for the same courses. And that can be a helpful guide, but it's also, I guess my regret is maybe overusing them and not putting together my own, which would have forced me to think more critically about the material in some of my 1L courses. And maybe, let me show up on the day of a few 1L exams with an inflated sense of confidence that I understood things and could apply it to a fact pattern.
My advice, or advice that I wish I had received, not that I did anything, that would make you think I didn't know this already, but it goes back to something Graham said earlier, is that the people you go to law school with are really your colleagues, for life. I was speaking to my judge recently. He graduated law school, I think in 81 or 82. He still remembers everybody from his section. He knows what they did with their careers. Some of them, he knows their spouses and children. Many of them he worked with over and over again. And he knows which people were, jerks in school and continued to be jerks in real life. And he knows which people were kind, which people are helpful, which people are honest. So kind of the day you step into, the law school building, which it's something, for more recent 1Ls, the day you log into Zoom, you start building, a reputation that's really going to follow you. People will remember you. So.
I'm sorry, one further comment from me. That your comment actually made me remember the answer I had intended to give to this question was some schools, do want letters of recommendation, or there are places further along in your career where it's helpful, really helpful, to develop a close relationship with an undergrad professor. And I didn't really do that during my undergrad experience. I took a lot of big survey courses. It was a little hard to do. I didn't take a ton of seminars. And when it came time to asking a professor for a recommendation, the professor who I was closest with was somebody who I had for a writing seminar as a freshman, who I'd stayed more or less in contact with, but couldn't speak to my sort of recent academic life. So that would have been that's my tip, is, to the extent that you can, either through be a TA or a research assistant, or take multiple classes with the same professor, or take a small seminar. That's actually well worth it if it means, forming a closer relationship with someone who can give you career guidance or can speak to your character and credentials later on. That is super helpful and important.
I think we'll take one or two questions more. All right. What is a valuable skill you learned in law school that you still use today?
I would say that law school, just like college, might not translate to law school, and the LSATs might not translate to law school. Same with law school not translating to being a lawyer, or even passing the bar being a great lawyer. So I don't have anything, but I do just want to emphasize that there's so many steps to becoming a lawyer that might seem a little arbitrary. So don't worry if you're not good at one, but you're better at another, because there's so many different ways to practice law that even if you struggle your 1L year, but you're amazing on your feet and you care about your clients, you could do a clinic your 3rd year and be the #1 clinic attorney. So don't get hung up on each little hurdle you have to get through, because it all feels kind of arbitrary until you get to practice. So I would say don't worry too much about any of it, because it's just learning it and getting better. It's really kind of just a process of learning.
Hi, Kelly. If I could just jump in. My name is Dovie King, and I'm the new pre-law advisor at Tufts. And I am so excited to attend tonight's program. It's fantastic. And I think all the speakers and the moderator, you're all doing a fantastic job. I just quickly wanted you to know who I am, and that I'm a resource to anyone, whether you've already graduated, are a professional, a different career, or a current student. You could make an appointment with me on Handshake. And just to let you know that I have 20 years of experience as a public interest lawyer. So doing solely work to help low-income communities and social justice work. Some of you have an interest in that, and I'm happy to talk to anyone regardless of what your interest is, but that's just my background. Thanks for a great program.
Thanks, Dovie. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. Otherwise, I just want to thank all our panelists for coming out tonight. Lots of great answers, great questions from all the students who came out tonight. I just want to remind everyone that we have Law Day on the Hill coming up on March 10th, and you can RSVP for that using the link Amy just provided. Definitely reach out to Dovie with any questions. I know the Tufts Pre-Law Advisor was super helpful in my law school journey, so you definitely cannot go wrong with that. Like, she's an amazing resource. And then you can keep involved with me. I put my email in the chat for you guys to reach out with any questions. And yeah, have a great rest of your night. Otherwise, thanks so
Thank
much
you
for
so
joining
much.
us.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.